Revealed in upcoming episodes of this program are the contents of a recently unearthed repository classified by the secret government, the Phenomenon Archives.
Shortly after 7 a.m. on June 30th, 1908, in the cold vastness of central Siberia near the Tunguska River, farmers, herdsmen, and trappers watch in awe as a cylindrical object glowing with blinding white light and a fiery tail streaks across the morning horizon. The object is 6 to 10 kilometers above the ground, directly over a desolate region of tundra and pine forest. At 7:17, it explodes in a tremendous ball of fire, laying to waste over 2,000 square kilometers of earth, equivalent to an area larger than Los Angeles. The resulting firestorms last for several weeks, burning an additional 10,000 kilometers surrounding the flashpoint. This explosion is felt several thousand kilometers away. Strangely, upon investigation of this location 19 years later, no impact crater of any kind is found, and no conclusive evidence is released from the site to enable scientists to determine what created this massive explosion. Until now.
The sheer immensity of the blast at Tunguska has intimidated scientists and researchers for over 9 decades. Since the scientific know-how to cause an explosion of this magnitude was not within humanity's capability until decades after the event, man-made causes were ruled out early on. But there are matters that have come to light since the unearthing of the Phenomenon Archives, which should encourage scientists to revisit all possibilities. At the time, Russia was going through a major transition. A revolutionary uprising occurred in 1905. It failed. But soon after, the Russians were to enter World War I, wherein 1,700,000 Russian lives were lost. Then the Tsar fell. The Bolsheviks took over, and, well, needless to say, no one was rushing up to Siberia to check out a bunch of knocked down trees and some sick farmers.
After 90 years of investigation of this crash site by thousands of scientists from Russia and dozens of other countries, there is still no consensus among scientists as to the identity of the object or its origin. Recently, thousands of participants in an international space convention held in Bologna, Italy, failed to grasp any further understanding or form any scientific consensus regarding the phenomenon.
Были определенные точности заданы, это минимально необходимые точности для того заданы, это минимально добились.
Professor Envy Vasilyev, chairman of the Scientific Organizing Committee of the Russian Academy of Sciences, admits during this convention that the explosion is of a non-terrestrial object of still unknown origin, and that an unambiguous, comprehensive solution addressing all of the problems involved in a logical, scientific explanation is not achievable with the available evidence.
A group of scientists found the impact point, and they found something very interesting, namely a forest that for many square miles had been knocked down, and all the trees were pointing radially away from the impact point. And at the impact point was a great big hole in the ground. Now, what's interesting about it is nothing was found of whatever caused the impact. There is the forest torn down, there's the great big holes, and nothing else.
The available body of evidence both supports and contradicts all of the explanations previously put forward to account for the explosion. Conflicting evidence confounds many of the competing proposals. These range from the impact of an asteroid or comet to contact with antimatter particles, a mini black hole, or even a futuristic weapons discharge. Some evidence, apparently collected many years ago by Russian scientists, was confiscated and, without explanation, concealed by the Ministry of State Security, later to become known as the KGB. Now presented for the first time is an account of this mysterious explosion by one of the last surviving eyewitnesses. Exposed here are the fallacies in current scientific theories and explanations set forth to interpret what actually occurred in Tunguska on that fateful morning in 1908. Soviet Union's KGB now admits to being an accessory to a covert Russian cover-up intended to suppress and conceal crucial evidence. He explains his role in the government's scheme to conceal the conclusions reached by many Russian scientists privy to the evidence gathered at Tunguska, that Tunguska actually bears the scars of an authentic 90-year-old crash site of an interplanetary spaceship of extraterrestrial origin. Considering the role taken by the Russian government in attempting to conceal the truth about this event, coupled with the virtual impossibility of explaining the explosion by any natural means, this occurrence seems frighteningly similar to the event occurring in 1947 in the United States near Roswell, New Mexico. With all the available evidence considered, Tunguska may well represent the equivalent of a Russian Roswell. Just prior to the Tunguska explosion in 1908, observatories and meteorologists around the world note a series of atmospheric oddities, including the formation and movement of unusual clouds, an unusually strong aurora borealis, and solar halos. No one is able to directly connect these atmospheric oddities with the Tunguska object. However, the coincidences in time between the sudden occurrence of these strange atmospheric activities followed by the explosion strongly suggest that they are connected in some way.
Я была ребенком. Я работала с папой на ферме.
I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time I saw it with my father. We were farming in a little village near the railroad tracks, and I'll never forget how it looked like a long, round chimney on its side with a long tail of fire. I remember telling everybody I could that it looked at first like it was coming down, but then angled up for a little while, and then I was absolutely positive that it had changed its direction.
As many as 900 eyewitnesses living near the crash give similar accounts. Their stories consistently speak of an object that changes trajectory, maneuvering in a way that defies any logical scientific explanation of a naturally occurring event. It is physically impossible for a meteor or comet caught in the Earth's gravitational pull to change direction while falling through our atmosphere. Whatever the phenomenon may have been, it did not behave like any object known to nature.
It disappeared over the next mountain ridge. And I remember like it was yesterday, how a few seconds later it seemed like the entire world ended. There was a flash that filled the entire sky, and it was like the sky opened up and split in half. I put my hands over my eyes and I could see the bones in my hands.
Given the remoteness of the area, the onset of World War I, and the civil conflicts within Russia which result in the Communist Revolution, it is 1927 before an expedition is mounted to investigate the site of the Tunguska event. Upon arrival at the site, the members of this expedition are awestruck by the carnage and the extent of the devastation still evident 19 years after the explosion. Trees the size of telephone poles are snapped like toothpicks in a radial pattern away from the central point of the blast, splayed out like spokes on a bicycle wheel. Even so, no crater is discovered, and there are no traces of a large meteorite found in the vicinity. There are, however, many small metallic fragments embedded in the fallen trees. These are collected for analysis. Many people living near the explosion site reportedly die of an unknown illness, showing symptoms not previously known to the region.
I could not get over the fact that so many of my friends and family were getting sick, and many of them died when still young. They were healthy before, and I just could not figure out why they got sick and died.
900 kilometers from the blast, an observatory buried deep in Irkutsk, Siberia, records disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field, as well as several magnetic storms occurring at the same time, or just following the Tunguska event. These anomalies cannot be explained by any natural means. No basis for explaining either the explosion or the resulting abnormalities exist until after World War II. Then, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, aerial photographs of these cities are compared with aerial photographs of the Tunguska site. The photographs are surprisingly similar, with the notable exception that the Tunguska site is very much larger by comparison. Another stunning observation reveals that people living near the two bomb blasts in Japan experience identical symptoms of ill health to those in the vicinity of Tunguska. Many experts believe that the people who die of the strange illness near Tunguska lose their lives as a result of radiation poisoning.
Stalin узнал о случившемся между Тунгуской и Хиросима.
When Stalin found out about the similarities between Tunguska and Hiroshima, he went absolutely nuts. He thought it could have been some UFO testing a new weapon that he could make use of, or something that could be used against the Americans. Stalin just wanted to know what the hell went on out there, and for someone to sort all of that out.
In July of 1947, Joseph Stalin personally gives specific instructions to the head of the Ministry of State Security, later to become the KGB, to investigate Tunguska. He is to involve the world's foremost rocket scientist and designer, S.P. Korolev. Korolev later becomes the father of the Russian space program.
Sergei Korolev was a larger-than-life figure. In the late 50s and early 60s, he would change the face of world history by, among other things, sending the first manned rocket into space. Considering his stature with his peers, the position he would take on the Tunguska event would likely represent the final word on the subject. To the Supreme Soviet, the word of S.P. Korolev was as authentic as Russian vodka. But if they could have predicted his conclusions, they might have kept that vodka for themselves.
Once the Russians succeed in developing the technology to explode thermonuclear weapons, they conduct numerous test detonations high in the atmosphere. They find that these explosions produce disruptions in the Earth's magnetic field, resulting in geomagnetic storms. These storms produce readings that are identical to those recorded by the Irkutsk Observatory during and after the Tunguska explosion of 1908. Further evidence of a nuclear blast and residual radiation fallout is revealed some years later, when Russian scientists and experts find that virtually all of the trees at Tunguska undergo abnormal accelerated growth for years subsequent to the blast. This is scientifically proven to be the result of genetic mutation caused by radiation exposure. Korolev himself equips an expedition to investigate the explosion site at Tunguska. By the late 1950s, a number of expeditions confirm finding residual traces of radiation throughout the blast region. A mystified Korolev is unable to explain the occurrence through any natural means. He concludes that the blast must have been caused by the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle.
Once radiation traces were found out there, my superiors instructed a team of us to lock down the whole place and to take possession of all objects that were ever collected from the site. We told all of the people there who saw the object years ago to say that it was only a big meteor. Otherwise, they would get a free ticket to a Siberian prison camp. We thought for sure that we would find some alien body parts or spacecraft chunks or nuclear bomb parts. And the last thing we wanted to do was to share any findings with the Americans.
Many of the scientists involved in this investigation of Tunguska lose their jobs or are invited by the KGB to a long-term expedition deep in Siberia. TASS, the Soviet government-controlled newspaper, does an about-face, stating several times that the explosion is not a UFO after all, but is simply the result of a comet or asteroid impact. These reports help solidify this now long-accepted official story of the Tunguska blast.
We did collect some papers and samples of odd-shaped metal and rock pieces, but I never did find out whatever happened to any of that, or whether or not anyone else found out about what the story was. All I was told to do was to have people not say that it was a UFO. We had all of the materials sent to a secret military base just south of Vanovara in Siberia, but I don't know what happened to it since then.
That area became the top secret area in the Soviet Union. And people were brought in there, including their families. And security was extremely tight. The United States, trying to get information, set up listening posts. And then, of course, using the U-2 spy plane, overflew the area. But the Russians spent a tremendous amount of effort isolating the test area and keeping everything as secret as they could, out of the even the prying eyes of people in Moscow.
You know, when we talk about the secrecy, we must begin to talk about the society. And we have this history for the decades. It was anti-capitalist, it was anti-Japan, it was anti-German, everybody was suspicious to each other. So in living on all this history, it was impossible then to change everything. So when Khrushchev came to power, he made our society much less closed. But before, everything was secret. Now, still many things remain secret which had no explanation.
For over 3 generations, the Russians have successfully kept the facts about Tunguska from the world. Scientists and experts from around the globe spin their wheels writing papers and treatises in an attempt to explain the explosion and crash site by natural means. The most popular explanation of this event, the official story, is that it is caused by either an asteroid or comet. Comets and asteroids are essentially leftover debris from the birth of our solar system 4.5 billion years ago, when a giant star exploded, leaving an enormous ball of dust, which ultimately evolves into our sun and planets.
The Earth orbits the sun in a sort of cosmic shooting gallery, with comets and asteroids coming by all the time. At any particular moment, there's likely to be 1 or 2 between us and the moon that are 30 or 40 feet in diameter or larger. We don't usually distinguish between comets and asteroids because once it hits, it really doesn't matter what it was. Asteroids are made of rocky material, comets are made of icy material, but if you're hit by one, it really doesn't matter any more than you would care if you were shot, whether the bullet that shot you was made of lead or steel.
If you look at the moon, it's heavily cratered. If you look at Mars, heavily cratered. Mercury's heavily cratered. The Earth was also heavily cratered. It's just that here on Earth, the effect of all the erosional processes and the tectonic processes which create mountains and earthquakes have erased the record. But in fact, the Earth would have looked just like those other bodies had it not been for the weathering and the tectonic processes, the geophysical processes.
The largest well-documented impact was 65 million years ago. We don't know if it was a comet or an asteroid, but we do know that it struck the Earth in the Yucatan region of Mexico, producing a crater about 150 miles across, and that it created such a profound environmental catastrophe that most life on Earth came to an end. The majority of the species went extinct, including the dinosaurs.
There have been several instances of comets and asteroids smacking the Earth. The most recent, perhaps, is the so-called Tunguska event in Russian Siberia, where in 1908, an object probably the size of several houses smacked into the Earth's atmosphere and caused an explosion that knocked down trees for 30 miles in either direction. And this was an object that was only about 60 meters in size, just over the half the size of a football field. And it didn't even hit the Earth because it broke up in the Earth's atmosphere.
Meteors smack into the Earth or disintegrate in the atmosphere all the time. There's nothing new or surprising about that. What then makes the Tunguska blast so unique? Why was it kept a secret for so long?
Scientists offer one explanation, that an asteroid about the size of a 25-story building, comprised of a loose conglomeration of small rocks and minerals, enters the Earth's atmosphere on a collision course with our planet. Due to atmospheric friction, the object heats up to several thousand degrees and explodes, disintegrating in a huge ball of fire. It is indeed possible that a rock weighing about 1 million tons could create such explosive power, and that it could even leave radioactive traces. And while this is still the cleanest and simplest explanation to accept, there are numerous evidentiary contradictions that oppose the asteroid theoretical conclusion. Normally, when an asteroid enters the Earth's atmosphere, it heats up to incredible temperatures and explodes at a very high altitude. If the meteor is very large, it slams into the Earth, dredging up billions of tons of soil and rock.
Perhaps the best-known example is Meteor Crater in Arizona. That was made by an impact of an iron object about 100 feet across. And it exploded with an energy that we can estimate from the crater itself as about 15 megatons, about the size of the largest nuclear bombs. It left a scar. It's 50,000 years old, and there are half dozen other craters on the Earth of similar age that are also easily seen.
Virtually all of the other impact traces endured by Earth are erased almost as quickly as they appear, such that all impacts, except the most recent, go unnoticed.
Any object larger than about 50 feet across, with an explosive energy then of the order of several megatons, equivalent to a large nuclear bomb, is able to penetrate through our atmosphere and to explode either in the lower atmosphere or at the surface. So when one of those penetrations takes place, we end up with the equivalent of a large nuclear bomb going off, which of course could do terrible damage.
It is almost inconceivable that an object the size of a 25-story building and weighing over 1 million tons would disintegrate into dust particles without leaving any debris. The Arizona crater was caused by a meteor only 1/4 the size of the one theorized to have caused the Tunguska explosion, and that meteor made it to the surface intact. This contributes to the questionable nature of this explanation. A meteor effects as many of the eyewitnesses testified. Neither could it create the atmospheric oddities associated with the event. Primarily made up of a loose collection of rocks, a meteor would not disrupt the Earth's magnetic field, nor create geomagnetic storms as occurred in the skies over Tunguska.
Recently, the suggestion was made that it was actually a chunk of a comet that smashed into the Earth. And in fact, it never really hit the ground, but it blew up a mile or so above the surface. And that is exactly what you would expect of something frail, like a great big chunk of ice like that.
Comets are made of rock and ice. Their spectacular tail occurs when the solar wind evaporates bits of ice, then blows these particles back for millions of kilometers. Scientists believe that there are trillions of comets beyond the furthest planet in a formation known as the Oort cloud. Periodically, one is dislodged from its distant orbit and is hurled toward the sun. A typical comet makes only one pass through the inner solar system during its lifetime.
Something on the order of, let's say, 10 meters in size would certainly not make it through the Earth's atmosphere, and probably something getting up to 50 meters would explode in the Earth's atmosphere, and you would have a shower of little debris coming down, but nothing that could create a large crater. Now, if we start moving up in size, something on the order of 100 meters in size will certainly make it through the Earth's atmosphere, unless perhaps if it's cometary and it's very, very fragile. Something about 80 meters in size impacted over Siberia in 1908, the Tunguska event.
While pieces from the tail of a comet can cause reactions in the upper atmosphere prior to entry and explosion, the comet theory does present other ambiguities which point to the rejection of this explanation. Comets are defined by the visual spectacle they create, with their brightness and long tail. It is therefore extremely unlikely that a comet could suddenly sneak up on the Earth without being witnessed from elsewhere on the planet. A comet, consisting mainly of ice, cannot cause the extraordinary geomagnetic storms, such as those which occurred over Tunguska, nor can it leave behind radioactive traces. Furthermore, a comet, once subject to Earth's gravitational pull, cannot change its course. Computer simulations clearly demonstrate that a comet of the size required to create this blast would disintegrate much higher in the atmosphere than the object that exploded over Tunguska. One of the more exotic explanations for the explosion is that particles of antimatter somehow formed over the Tunguska region, then exploded and came in contact with the positive matter molecules in the atmosphere. It is well documented in the scientific community that antimatter particles coming into contact with positive matter particles cancel each other out, potentially creating a massive explosion. This proposal stems from the residual radiation left over after the Tunguska explosion, the lack of a crater, and the lack of any eyewitness report of a mushroom cloud. The antimatter theory does not account for the atmospheric or geomagnetic oddities associated with the Tunguska explosion, or the eyewitness observations of an object streaking across the sky. With the lack of any rational explanation of how these antimatter particles formed, and the fact that these particles would have caused an explosion at a much higher point in the atmosphere, this theory may be dismissed based on the conflicting evidence. One of the least likely natural phenomena proposed to have caused this explosion is that of a mini black hole said to have come in contact with Tunguska. Black holes are tremendously dense objects. such that a mass the size of the Earth could fit into the space the size of a tennis ball. Their gravitational pull is so strong it can distort even light waves. Since the gravitational force and mass required to create a black hole is so enormous, it is virtually impossible for a pin-sized black hole to exist. A black hole any larger than a pin coming close to the Earth would certainly have catastrophic planetary consequences. For this and other reasons, the black hole theory can also be dismissed as having no relevant merits. Since the available evidence for any naturally occurring explanation is conflicting and contradictory, some experts propose man-made causes for the explosion. The most publicized explanation is the theory that the explosion was caused by a high-energy beam originating from the laboratory of Nikola Tesla in New York, and that he created this beam as a demonstration for Admiral Peary, who was making his final assault on the North Pole. According to this theory, Tesla overshot the mark and caused the Tunguska explosion. The national network broadcast TV program Sightings presented this explanation as the one and only means by which this explosion could have occurred. This theory is absolutely ludicrous. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw an object hurl through the sky and then explode. Even our present-day technology cannot muster the electrical energy required to create a thermonuclear blast of 40 megatons, project that amount of energy halfway around the world, and decimate 2,000 square kilometers of Earth. Even if so great an electrical discharge could be generated, sending it through the fragile ionosphere would rip away and ionize half of the planet's upper atmosphere, killing all life on the planet. The pattern of tree destruction at Tunguska clearly indicates a gigantic, high-altitude explosion, rather than an electrical discharge. Furthermore, an electrical discharge would leave no radioactive readings at the site. Therefore, a Tesla weapon, electrical energy discharge theory, is highly suspect and not supported by the available evidence.
At the risk of confusing you, I'd like to add this footnote. In our review of the Phenomenon Archives, we have uncovered the design and blueprint for a Nikola Tesla particle beam weapon. You remember Tesla, the great inventor who some people said was a nutcase? Because this weapon was never officially tested, there's no record of what effect it could have had. According to the New York Times, Tesla himself boasted that it could cause armies of millions to drop in their tracks. Who knows? Sounds pretty wacky. But Tesla wasn't exactly your average Joe.
Of all the proposed scientific theories, the only one that addresses all of the variables considered while taking into account the Russian government cover-up is that the Tunguska explosion was not natural in origin. On October 4th, 1959, over 51 years after the Tunguska explosion, the event earns a belated spot on the front page of the New York Times. Russian scientists report the discovery of radiation at the site and their inability to explain the explosion by any natural means. Thwarted by conflicting evidence, their collective conclusion confirms that the event was a nuclear explosion caused by an object of extraterrestrial origin.
Professor so-and-so is quoted in the newspaper so-and-so as saying in Moscow that intelligent Martians may have developed artificial oxygen eons ago and moved underground. Recently developed theories, he said, include these. A great explosion in Siberia 50 years ago, Tunguska, was caused by the crash and disintegration of a nuclear spaceship, possibly from Mars. Parentheses, an atomic explosion was sighted on Mars 2 years ago. This is 1959,
okay? As shocking as this may seem, it is now proposed that the Tunguska blast resulted from an exploding nuclear or ion-powered engine belonging to an interplanetary spacecraft. The eyewitness accounts of an object descending, then angling upwards slightly, can be explained by NASA's own study of spacecraft re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Re-entry can only be accomplished within a 2-degree angle of descent. If the spacecraft enters at too steep an angle, it disintegrates high in the atmosphere as a result of heat caused by friction. If the angle of re-entry is too shallow, the spacecraft descends, goes back up and out of the atmosphere, much like a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. It is hypothesized that the alien craft entered the atmosphere at too shallow an angle and began skipping out of the Earth's atmosphere. When it attempted to change course, overheating caused by atmospheric friction caused the craft to explode. The explosion itself and the associated evidence is not at all consistent with a meteor or comet chemical explosion, but is consistent with a 40-megaton thermonuclear blast about 6 to 10 kilometers high in the atmosphere. The residual radiation, people dying of radiation poisoning, the abnormal accelerated growth of trees as a result of genetic mutation, geomagnetic disturbances, the want of an impact crater, the complete lack of any meteor fragments or comet debris, the collection of atomic fragments, and the Russian government's suppression of all other evidence concerning this crash site leaves only one theory intact. The event occurring in Tunguska in 1908 was the result of an explosion of a nuclear or ion-powered engine of an interplanetary spacecraft. As early as the late 1960s, NASA began test-firing nuclear engines for 21st century spacecraft. It continues to research the viability of nuclear-powered and ion-powered engines for interplanetary and interstellar travel. These engines will likely require at least as much nuclear material to cause a similar-sized detonation as that observed over Tunguska.
Well, NASA's been involved in the development of ion propulsion for over 30 years now, and very early they were able to demonstrate good engine performance. But because these engines have such low thrust levels compared to chemical rockets, very, very long burn times are required for typical planetary missions, on the order of 8,000 to 12,000 hours. So the hardest part of working with ion propulsion is demonstrating that the engine has enough lifetime for those kinds of missions.
The design and concept for such a spacecraft is not all science fiction. It is likely to be the design of our own human expedition spaceships within the next 100 years. Small-scale early versions are already being built for unmanned probes that will reach beyond the outer limits of our solar system.
The NSTAR thruster will be used first on the first New Millennium mission, which is a comet and asteroid flyby. Subsequent missions in which it might be used would be small body rendezvous missions or perhaps outer planet missions.
The question remaining is why condemn this enormous and important terrestrial event to obscurity? Why hide the truth and the evidence from the people of the world? Well, the fact is that this kind of government suppression is not without precedent.
In 1947, the United States government began a massive cover-up of an alien crash site at Roswell, New Mexico. For over 50 years, it has continued this conspiracy, hiding the truth from the American people. Reports of the U.S. military concealing both a recovered interplanetary spacecraft and alien occupants have made the Roswell crash by far the world's most famous example of humanity's contact with extraterrestrial life and government cover-up. The Tunguska crash predates Roswell by nearly 4 decades. Even though no spacecraft or alien occupants are known to have been recovered, the suppression of facts and confiscation of materials collected from the site by the KGB, in addition to their program of discrediting eyewitness accounts, bears striking similarities to the U.S. cover-up of the crash site at Roswell.
There was clear evidence that there is more history to the Earth and the present situation than history now properly describes. And that became knowledgeable to both the United States and the Soviet Union in the mid-50s. And the accelerated programs to go into space, if you got to look back, you got to say, well, why all of a sudden space? Was there someone here before? Is there someone else here now? What about the planets? Are we the only planet with any form of life? Or are we the only planet that had life? The Soviets immediately, after getting into orbit, started pursuing other things, grandeur.
I think was very deeply ingrained into the Soviet leadership that there is something real out there, and that they had to have a program in place to defend the country as much from space threats as from ground threats or air threats or water threats. And so there was a military character to the space program, both from the standpoint of threat reduction and from the standpoint of threat projection. They wanted to get their military objects into space and then back into the atmosphere at the right place, and satellites could help guide that as well as manage the process, but also that there might be threats coming from extraterrestrial life. And they'd seen some of the direct impact. I mean, that particular event in 1908 was a pretty powerful event.
Tunguska scared the pants off the Russians. They were sure that little green men were going to plop down in their living rooms and start kicking their butts across the tundra. The good news is that it gave them a hot foot for getting into space, which of course inspired guess who to do the same.
So they had a tremendously aggressive program. Within the first 5 years, they launched the first satellites to go to the moon and photograph it, the first satellites to head towards Venus and head towards Mars. That's an extremely aggressive schedule. And I think it warrants us looking at why they were doing this. But you got to remember too that the Soviets are in a military society, that military is number one, and a tremendous amount of resources were being spent on the space program, which may or may not have given back military gains. So I think we need to go rethink that, what were they doing? What was their intention?
Perhaps further warming of relations between Russian and American politicians and scientists will ultimately allow for the release and analysis of the confiscated metallic fragments still hidden at the Siberian military base. With the rejection of all natural explanations for this explosion, only the release of the sole existing material evidence will assist scientists in explaining this phenomenon. Overlooked for 9 decades, the crash site at Tunguska could represent the most significant and historic, yet nearly forgotten discovery in the history of humanity.
Recounting the lessons of history from the long neglected stories of tragedy and intrigue. These are the Phenomenon Archives, what you've never seen and what you're not supposed to know. I'm Dean Stockwell. Thanks for tuning in.